They told him to fall back. The command was clear: retreat, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. But one soldier refused. Standing in the mud, surrounded by smoke and death, he made a choice that would defy every rule in the book. For 3 days and nights, he and his dwindling unit held their ground against overwhelming odds. What began as an act of disobedience turned into one of the most courageous last stands in World War II, a moment that changed the course of a battle no one expected them to survive. War doesn't always reward obedience. Sometimes history remembers those who dared to say no. In the chaos of World War II, when orders were absolute and hesitation meant death, one man's defiance saved hundreds and became a legend whispered among the ranks. This is the story of a commander who went against every command given to him, not out of pride, but out of duty. What drove him to stand his ground when retreat was the only option? What did he see in that battlefield that others didn't? This is the untold story of the man who refused to retreat, and in doing so, became the soldier who saved a war-torn front from total collapse. The morning sky was a grey curtain of smoke and frost when Sergeant William Harland received the order, "Fall back, the line is broken." His hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. For 3 days and nights, he and his platoon had been fighting in the ruins of a nameless French village, a place where every building was a tomb, every street a graveyard. The German advance had been relentless, tanks rolling over the cobblestones, artillery shaking the earth, and the radio calls growing more desperate by the hour. When the retreat command came through, every man knew what it meant: abandon the position or die defending it. But for Harland, retreating wasn't an option. Behind him lay a column of wounded men, trapped civilians, and the last intact bridge connecting to the Allied rear. If that bridge fell, so would the entire flank. So when the voice crackled again, "Through the static, pull out immediately," he simply turned off the radio. For the first time in his life, he disobeyed a direct order, and that defiance would change everything. The first day of the stand was chaos. Harland gathered the remnants of his unit, barely 20 soldiers left from the original 70. Their uniforms were torn, ammunition low, morale even lower, but the sergeant's voice cut through the smoke like iron. "If we leave, they'll roll through here by morning. We hold this line." There was no speech, no heroics, just cold resolve. They fortified what was left of the village, overturned trucks as barricades, machine guns set in church windows, mines planted on the narrow road leading in. By noon, the first wave came, German infantry in grey coats moving through the mist. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley like thunder. The platoon fought with everything they had, each shot deliberate, each second precious. They were not trying to win, they were trying to delay. Every minute they held meant another convoy could cross that bridge to safety. Harland fought beside his men, rifle in hand, face blackened with soot. When night fell, the ground was littered with bodies, friend and foe alike, and the village was burning. Still, they held. By the second day, the radio had gone silent. No reinforcements, no supplies. The men were hungry, bleeding, and half-mad from fatigue. Snow began to fall, mixing with ash, covering the fallen in a quiet white shroud. Private Collins, barely 19, whispered to Harland, "We're not gonna make it, are we?" The sergeant looked at him, an eyes hollow, voice steady. "Not if we stop fighting." They scavenged weapons from the dead, melted snow in helmets for water, and used ration crumbs as meals. Harland wrote a brief message on a scrap of paper. "Holding the line. Bridge secure." He tucked it into his jacket, unsure if anyone would ever read it. By afternoon, the Germans returned, this time with tanks. The ground shook with every shell. The church that had served as their stronghold collapsed in flames. Yet even as debris rained down, Harland refused to yield. He ordered his men to fall back to the last row of houses, setting traps along the road. When a tank finally breached the square, it hit one of the mines they had buried the night before. The explosion sent fire and smoke into the air, a momentary victory carved from desperation. Harland's men cheered, but he didn't. He knew more were coming. By the third day, only 8 men remained. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their shelter reduced to rubble. Harland could barely stand. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his leg the night before. Still, he refused the morphine. He needed a clear head. At dawn, the horizon lit up again with enemy artillery. The platoon crouched in the basement of a half-destroyed farmhouse, listening to the thunder above. "This is it," someone murmured. Harland just nodded. He knew they couldn't hold much longer, but the longer they delayed, the more lives they saved elsewhere. It was no longer about victory. It was about meaning. The men followed him without question now. When their last machine gun jammed, they switched to rifles. When rifles ran out, they threw grenades. When grenades were gone, they used bayonets. It wasn't war anymore. It was survival. Each man fought like a ghost, defending the last piece of his world. By midday, they had repelled 3 more assaults. Smoke hung heavy over the ruins. Harland could hardly see, but he could feel the earth tremble. Allied artillery finally firing back from across the river. Reinforcements had arrived. He collapsed against the wall, smiling faintly as his vision blurred. The bridge, and everyone behind it, was safe. When the relief troops finally reached the village, they found Harland's platoon scattered among the ruins. Only 2 men were still alive. One of them, barely conscious, pointed toward the farmhouse. Inside, they found the sergeant slumped against a broken beam, his rifle across his knees, eyes open but unmoving. On the wall behind him, written in charcoal, were the words, "We held." That message, brief and final, became legend among the soldiers who later crossed that bridge into battle. In their reports, the higher-ups called it an unauthorized delay action. But among the men who survived because of it, it was something more, a miracle of defiance. They said the line had held because one man refused to retreat when every order told him to. His body was buried beside the road he'd defended, with a simple wooden marker, Sergeant William Harland. He stayed. Years later, historians would argue over whether his disobedience was justified, whether his choice had truly changed the course of the battle. But to those who were there, to the wounded who crossed the bridge, to the civilians who lived because the enemy was delayed, there was no question. In a war where obedience was everything, one man's refusal had given meaning to the chaos. His act of defiance wasn't rebellion. It was faith. Faith in the men who trusted him. Faith that some things were worth holding on to even when logic said to let go. They say heroes follow orders. But sometimes history is written by those who don't. As the hours dragged on, the silence between bombardments became almost unbearable. Every man in Harland's platoon could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the empty houses. The sound of boots crunching over shattered glass was the only reminder that they were still alive. The men didn't talk much anymore. Words had lost their weight. What was there left to say when every breath could be your last? But even in that hollow quiet, Harland's presence held them together like steel wire holding a collapsing bridge. He moved among them, limping, exhausted, his face streaked with ash, offering small nods instead of speeches. It wasn't courage he gave them. It was purpose. Hold the line, he had said, and those 3 words became the heartbeat of their survival. That night the enemy switched tactics. No longer rushing in waves, they began probing from different angles, testing for weaknesses. Harland knew what they were doing. He'd studied German strategy long enough to recognize the signs. "They're waiting for us to break," he told his corporal, voice hoarse. "So we don't." He sent 2 men to the clock tower, what was left of it, to keep watch even though the structure looked ready to fall at any moment. From there they could see flickers of enemy movement through the smoke, grey shapes, distant flashes of light, like ghosts moving through fog. The corporal returned, shivering, saying he saw one of the tanks shifting position, its cannon turning toward the village square. Harland simply nodded and said, "Then that's where we hit them first light." Sleep was impossible that night. The men lay in the rubble, some praying under their breath, others staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the artillery shells that fell miles away. By dawn, the snow had stopped, but the air was colder than ever. Frost covered their rifles, and the ground was slick with mud and blood frozen together. The smell, smoke, cordite decay clung to everything. Harland gathered his remaining men around the wreckage of an overturned jeep, spreading a crude map across its hood. "We've got 6 rounds left per man," he said quietly. "That's not enough to fight, but it's enough to make them think we still can." He outlined his plan. One last stand designed to buy them time until the Allies across the river realized what was happening. They would rotate firing positions, moving constantly so the enemy believed they were stronger than they were. He told them to shout, to fire sporadically, to make noise even when they couldn't see anyone to shoot. Confuse them, he said. Make them think there's more of us than ghosts. The men nodded. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were shadows fighting against inevitability. At mid-morning, the attack came. It started with artillery, then machine gun fire that shredded what little cover remained. Walls crumbled, roofs collapsed. One of the men, Private Mason, was hit in the chest, but refused to fall back. "Still got one bullet left," he rasped, blood seeping through his jacket. Harland crawled through the debris to drag him behind a wall, but Mason gripped his wrist. "Don't waste your strength on me, Sarge, just keep them busy." Harland didn't argue. He couldn't. There was no time, no room for mercy. The sergeant returned to his post, deafened by the roar of battle. Every explosion sent dust raining down like grey snow. Somewhere behind him, the church bell, somehow still hanging, swung weakly in the smoke, tolling once, then again, as if the village itself were mourning. By noon, the enemy had broken through the outer line. The platoon fell back to the bridge road, the last strip of land before open water. Harland ordered his men to take cover behind the remains of a stone wall, knowing this was their final defense. They had nothing left but sheer willpower. One of the tanks rumbled forward, its treads crushing the fallen beneath it. Harland signaled to Corporal Lewis, who held the last anti-tank grenade. "Wait," Harland whispered. Closer. The tank drew within 30 feet. "Now!" The explosion tore through the air, sending a shockwave across the street. The tank lurched, caught fire, and stopped. The men cheered weakly. It was the sound of dying hope refusing to die quietly. Then came the counterfire. The Germans responded with everything they had: mortars, machine guns, grenades. The ground shook so violently it felt like the world was ending. Harland was thrown against the wall, dazed, his ears ringing. He could taste blood in his mouth. When his vision cleared, he saw the corporal lying motionless beside him, his hand still clutching the empty grenade pin. Harland pressed his forehead against the cold stone, muttering something no one could hear, a mixture of apology and prayer. When he looked up again, his eyes had changed. Whatever fear had remained in him was gone. He limped back into the street, rifle in hand, and shouted, "You'll have to kill me to take it." His voice cracked through the smoke like thunder. And for a brief moment the enemy hesitated. Afternoon faded into another grey dusk. The village, once full of screams and gunfire, fell eerily quiet. Only the wind moved now, carrying with it the smell of smoke and death. Harland's platoon, what was left of it, held their ground behind the last wall of the bridge road. When the final German push came, it was desperate. A handful of soldiers trying to finish what hundreds had failed to do. The fight was brutal and close. Harland, bleeding from his leg and shoulder, swung his rifle like a club when his ammo ran out. He didn't think anymore. He just fought. Each breath was pain, each heartbeat another refusal to give in. Finally, as the last German soldier fell, silence returned. The sergeant sank to his knees, chest heaving, the world around him spinning. He looked toward the bridge, faintly visible through the smoke, intact. For the first time in 3 days, he allowed himself to breathe. That night, the stars returned. The bombardment stopped. Somewhere in the distance, Harland heard engines, not enemy tanks this time, but Allied trucks, reinforcements, relief. He smiled faintly, his face illuminated by the faint orange glow of burning ruins. He leaned against the wall, his rifle across his lap, and whispered, "We held." His voice was barely a breath, carried away by the wind. The men who came hours later found him that way, sitting upright, eyes open, as if he were still guarding the road. And maybe in a way he was. The third night felt longer than the war itself. The wind howled through broken windows, carrying whispers of the dead. Harland sat near the bridge's edge, a rifle balanced on his knees, staring into the darkness. His uniform was soaked in blood, not all of it his own, and his fingers trembled from exhaustion and cold. He could hear faint movement in the distance, enemy scouts testing the silence. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just waited. The stars above flickered dimly through the smoke, their light ghostly and pale. Around him lay what was left of his platoon, 4 men who hadn't slept or eaten properly in days, each lost somewhere between life and survival. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know when. Sometime past midnight, the first mortar fell. The explosion ripped through the road, throwing debris into the air like shards of glass. The men ducked instinctively, covering their heads. Then another shell hit, closer this time. The ground shook beneath them. Harlan shouted orders over the noise, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Positions! Don't let them cross that road." They scrambled behind the remnants of a wall, returning fire through the smoke. Tracer rounds lit up the night like lightning bugs of death, streaking red and yellow through the black sky. Harlan's rifle jammed. He slammed it against a brick and fired again. Every shot echoed like thunder in his chest. The enemy came in waves, silhouettes moving through the fog, their shouts guttural, their weapons flashing in the dark. Harlan counted them without realizing it. 10, 20, 30, maybe more. "We're surrounded!" Private Dempsey yelled. Harlan didn't respond. He just kept firing methodically, almost rhythmically. The fight had become mechanical. No thought, no fear, just instinct. He felt the sting of shrapnel slice across his cheek, smelled the metal and blood mixing in the frozen air. Somewhere behind him, one of his men screamed. Then silence again, another gone. He crawled to the side of the bridge where the detonator lay, their last resort if the enemy broke through. It was wired to explosives planted under the arch, meant to destroy the crossing rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Command had ordered him to blow it days ago, but he hadn't. Too many Allied soldiers had crossed since then, too many wounded evacuated. He couldn't bring himself to destroy what they had fought so hard to protect. Now kneeling beside it, he stared at the small black switch. One flick could end everything. The enemy, himself, the village. But it would also erase the line he'd promised to hold. He tightened his jaw, pulled his hand back and whispered, "Not yet." Hours blurred together in a haze of fire and screams. The last of their ammunition ran out before dawn. Harlan ordered the survivors to use anything they had left, captured rifles, grenades, even bayonets. When those were gone, it became hand-to-hand. He swung his rifle like a club, striking shadows in the smoke. A German soldier lunged at him with a knife. Harlan caught his wrist and drove the blade into the man's chest. He didn't even look away as the body fell. Blood steamed on the cold stones. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. He felt light-headed, his vision swimming, but he refused to fall. Each second he remained standing was another second the enemy failed to take the bridge. Then suddenly the sound changed. The rattle of machine guns faded, replaced by a low, distant hum by engines. For a brief moment Harlan thought he was imagining it, just another cruel trick of exhaustion. But then he saw it. Faint lights flickering through the fog from the far end of the valley. Reinforcements, Allied tanks. He laughed. A broken, rasping laugh that turned into a cough. "They made it," he whispered. "We did it." But the battle wasn't done. The enemy, desperate to finish what they started, launched one final assault. Grenades flew. Explosions tore through the road and the air became unbreathable. Harlan shouted for his men to fall back, to hold the last corner. Only 2 responded. The rest were gone. A tank shell struck nearby, throwing Harlan off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his leg twisting beneath him. Pain shot through his body like fire. He tried to stand, but his strength failed him. Crawling through the rubble, he reached for his rifle, his hands shaking. Another explosion lit up the sky, and for a split second he saw the bridge, still standing, still whole. A tear rolled down his cheek, cutting a clean line through the dirt on his face. "We held," he murmured again, forcing himself upright. The smoke cleared just enough for him to see figures approaching, Allied soldiers this time, moving quickly, shouting orders. He tried to call out, but his voice was gone. The last thing Harlan remembered was the cold stone against his back as he slumped beside the detonator. His fingers brushed the edge of the switch, but he didn't press it. He didn't have to anymore. Through the haze, he heard the sound of Allied artillery roaring across the valley, pushing the enemy back. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching. The bridge had survived, the line had held, and so had his men, at least long enough for history to catch up. When dawn broke, the battlefield was silent except for the crackle of fire. Allied medics moved among the ruins, calling out for survivors. They found Harlan still sitting by the bridge, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes open. One medic reached out, touched his shoulder and whispered, "He's gone." On the wall behind him, written in charcoal, were 2 words, "Still here." In the weeks that followed, word of his stand spread through the ranks like wildfire. Command called it an unauthorized act of resistance, but to the soldiers who heard the story, it became legend. They said one man's refusal had stopped an entire enemy column long enough to save hundreds of lives. Maps were redrawn because of it. Lives were measured by it. In every mess hall, every bunker, someone would whisper his name, not as a story of defiance, but of duty beyond orders. They said he had stared death in the face and chosen to stay, and maybe in some quiet frozen place he was still there, guarding that bridge, watching over the river. He refused to give up. Because that's what men like Sergeant William Harlan did. They didn't fight for glory or medals. They fought so others could live long enough to see another sunrise. His disobedience wasn't rebellion. It was devotion, the kind of devotion only born in the darkest corners of war. The sky began to glow faintly, not with sunlight but with fire. The entire horizon was burning, houses collapsing in bursts of orange, the wind carrying embers that floated like dying stars. Harlan blinked through the smoke, his eyes bloodshot, his mind somewhere between dream and delirium. He thought he heard his mother's voice for a second, soft and far away, calling him by the name she used when he was a boy. But when he turned, there was no one. Only the snow melting in streaks of red and the steady rhythm of distant gunfire. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. His left leg was useless, the wound too deep. He pressed his hand to it. Warmth gushed through his finger, but he didn't wince. Pain had become background noise now, like the hum of artillery far away. His mind was fixed on one thing, the bridge. If the bridge stood, they'd made it. That was all that mattered. Through the haze, he could just make out the shape of it, arching quietly over the river like a shadow of salvation. He whispered, "Still there, still ours." A rustle caught his attention, footsteps crunching on debris. He raised his rifle, but his arms felt like lead. Then a figure appeared through the smoke. Private Dempsey dragging himself forward, his face pale, one arm limp. "Sergeant," he croaked. "There," regrouping. Harlan grabbed him by the collar, pulling him behind a slab of broken wall. "You hold here," he said firmly. "You see anyone cross that road, you stop them." "Understood," Dempsey nodded, blood running from his temple. "Understood." Harlan gave him a faint smile. Good lad. Minutes felt like hours. The air was so thick with smoke that breathing hurt. Harlan's ears rang constantly, a shrill whistle that never stopped. But underneath it, he began to hear something else. The enemy was chanting. Not words exactly, but short, sharp shouts, signals, orders. They were coming again. He could feel it before he saw it. The ground trembled with the rhythm of boots. Harlan reached for his rifle, checked the chamber. 2 bullets left. He looked at Dempsey. Make them count. When the enemy emerged from the fog, it was like a tide of ghosts. Dozens of grey uniforms moving in perfect unison. They came silently at first, then all at once, shouting, firing, advancing over the corpses of those who'd fallen before. Harlan and Dempsey opened fire. The first 2 soldiers dropped instantly, the others hesitating just long enough for Harlan to reload. But his movements were slow now, his hands stiff from cold and blood loss. A bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him backward. He hit the ground hard, his head slamming against the stone. The world tilted sideways, fading to black for a heartbeat. When he came to, the battle was closer. Too close. He could hear boots on the bridge, the metallic clang of weapons against railings. He turned his head toward Dempsey's position. The young private was still firing, shouting curses between gasps. Then a flash, a grenade. The explosion was deafening. When the smoke cleared, Dempsey was gone. Harlan's chest tightened, but he didn't cry. There was no time for grief. He pulled himself forward, using his elbows, crawling toward the detonator box. His blood left a trail behind him, a dark ribbon on the broken stones. He reached the device, stared at the switch. The metal was cold against his fingers. His breathing was shallow now, every inhale a knife in his ribs. He thought about the order that started it all, the one he'd refused. Retreat. If he'd obeyed, the bridge would be gone, the rear overrun. Every man who'd crossed since then would be dead. Disobedience had become his duty. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Forgive me." Then, through the roar of the battle, he heard something impossible. Engines. At first, he thought it was the enemy again, bringing tanks to crush what remained. But the pitch was different, deeper, steadier. He turned his head and saw them. Allied vehicles, dark shapes moving across the far side of the river. Trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, reinforcements at last. The sight stole his breath. He tried to sit up, but his body screamed in protest. Still, he smiled, a cracked, weary smile. They'd made it. The line had held long enough. He wanted to laugh, but it came out as a ragged cough. Gunfire erupted again, the enemy realizing too late what was happening. Harland watched as the first Allied shells streaked through the dawn, slamming into the advancing troops. Fire blossomed across the valley. The enemy line broke, soldiers scattering in panic. Harland's vision blurred, but he could see enough to know it was over. They were retreating now. The irony wasn't lost on him. The men who ordered him to retreat had lived because he hadn't. The adrenaline drained from his body, replaced by a crushing weight of exhaustion. His hands slipped from the detonator. He leaned back against the wall, tilting his head toward the sky. Snowflakes drifted down again, melting as they touched his skin. For the first time in days, the air was quiet. No gunfire, no shouting, just the soft whisper of the river. He could almost hear the laughter of his men, distant and faint, as if echoing from another world. Mason, Lewis, Collins, Dempsey, all of them. He imagined them standing on the bridge, waving him forward. A medic from the relief unit finally reached him. "Jesus, we've got one alive here," the man shouted. Harland blinked, trying to focus. The medic knelt beside him, pressing bandages against the wound in his leg. "Stay with me, Sergeant." "You did it, do you hear me?" "You did it." Harland tried to respond, but his lips barely moved. The medic leaned closer. "What's that?" Harland's voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Tell them." "We held." The medic froze, looking into his eyes. Calm, steady, unflinching even as the light began to fade from them. Harland took one final breath, his hand falling away from the rifle that never left his side. And then he was gone. The medic sat there for a moment, staring at him in silence. Around them, the battlefield buzzed with life again. Reinforcements moving through, engineers inspecting the bridge, officers shouting orders. But in that small corner of ruin, time had stopped. The medic reached for a piece of charcoal from the debris and wrote on the wall beside Harland's body the same words he'd heard him say, "We held." When command finally learned what had happened, they called it a strategic anomaly. They said Harland had ignored orders, that he should have retreated when told. But privately, those who understood the cost saw it differently. The bridge became known as Harland's Crossing. Every unit that passed over it left a small token, a shell casing, a dog tag, a flower, in his memory. Some said the place felt sacred, as if his spirit still stood watch over the valley. Months later, when the snow melted and spring returned, a new sign was placed beside the bridge. It read, "In memory of Sergeant William Harland, whose disobedience became our salvation." Over time, the story spread far beyond the battlefield. It was retold in mess halls, in letters home, in quiet conversations between soldiers who'd never met him, but swore they felt his presence. They said that in the worst moments of the war, when orders made no sense and everything seemed lost, men would whisper, "Remember Harland. Remember the one who stayed." And maybe in the eternal silence that follows every war, he was still there. A ghost not of sorrow, but of duty. Watching, guarding, reminding those who came after that. Sometimes the greatest act of obedience is saying no. Because courage isn't following orders. It's knowing when to break them. When the guns finally fell silent, and the last plume of smoke curled into the cold morning sky, the war moved on, as wars always do. But there are places it never truly leaves. The bridge where Sergeant Harland made his stand became one of them. Even when rebuilt, repaired, and renamed by history, those stones carried more than the weight of passing vehicles. They carried memory, the kind that hums beneath your feet if you stand there long enough and listen. For most soldiers, following orders is sacred. It's what keeps the chaos in check, what separates discipline from disaster. But sometimes in the fog of war, there comes a moment when a man must decide which order matters most, the one he's given or the one his conscience whispers. Harland's choice wasn't born of arrogance or rebellion. It came from clarity. the kind that only exists in men who've seen what failure would cost. He didn't disobey to be remembered. He disobeyed because he knew no one else would stand if he didn't. In the days that followed, word of his stand spread quietly through the ranks. It wasn't printed in the newspapers, nor celebrated with medals at first. It was spoken of in whispers, as if sacred. Command called it a breach of protocol, but the men on the ground called it something else: salvation. They knew that his refusal to retreat had saved an entire flank, that his stubbornness had kept the bridge open long enough for hundreds to cross to safety, and maybe that's what makes his story timeless. It's not about strategy or rank or glory. It's about conviction, about the rare kind of courage that burns even when hope is gone. The kind of courage that doesn't ask for permission. Years later, after the war, when Europe began to rebuild and peace felt like a fragile miracle, a small ceremony was held at that bridge. There were no grand speeches, no generals in polished boots, just a few surviving soldiers, older now, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. They placed a wreath of wildflowers on the rail and bowed their heads. One of them, a grey-haired man with trembling hands, had whispered, "He stayed so we could go home, that's all anyone said." It was enough. Time moved on as it always does. The battle faded into textbooks. The bridge became a route on a map, and Harlan's name slipped quietly into the margins of forgotten reports. But every so often a traveler would stop, look at the sign, Harlan's Crossing, and wonder who he was. Some would search, read his story, and find themselves lingering a little longer, staring at the water that once ran red, thinking about what kind of man it takes to stand alone against orders, against fear, against fate itself, and perhaps that's the real legacy he left behind. Not in medals or monuments, but in questions. Questions that reach across generations. Would you have done the same? Would you have stayed when told to run? Would you have risked everything not to win, but simply to hold the line? Because sometimes history isn't shaped by those who charge forward, but by those who refuse to move. In the end, Harlan didn't die a hero by design. He died a soldier doing what he believed was right, and that distinction matters more than any title. His stand reminds us that morality and obedience aren't always the same, that even in war, when the world is painted in black and white, there are moments of impossible grey. And in that grey, one man's conscience can change the outcome of everything. If you walk that bridge today, it's quiet. The only sounds are the wind and the hum of distant traffic, but some locals still say that at dawn, when the fog hangs low and the first light touches the river, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of gunfire, the whisper of orders shouted across the cold air, and the ghostly rhythm of boots that will never move again. No one knows if that's true. But those who believe say it's not haunting, it's honoring, that maybe, just maybe, Sergeant Harlan never left. Maybe he still stands there, unseen but eternal, watching the sunrise he fought to protect. In every war there are stories like his, stories that live quietly between the lines of official records, the ones that never make it into speeches, because they remind us of something uncomfortable, that sometimes victory depends not on obedience, but on the courage to defy it. So when history looks back, it doesn't see the medals or the ranks, it sees moments. Moments like Harlan's, when a man's refusal became a nation's survival, and maybe that's the truest kind of bravery there is. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demands to be remembered, but the kind that holds the line, even when no one's watching, because in the end wars are fought by orders, but won by hearts that refuse to break. For 3 days, one man's refusal to retreat changed the course of a battle that should have been lost. Sergeant Harlan's defiance wasn't born out of pride or rebellion. It came from the unshakable belief that some lines simply cannot be surrendered. When every command told him to fall back, his heart told him to stay. That decision, that act of disobedience, being saved hundreds and turned a forgotten bridge into a symbol of courage that outlived the war itself. History often remembers the generals, the speeches, the strategies, but behind every victory are men like Harlan, soldiers who stood their ground when the world told them not to. They are the quiet heroes who never asked for recognition, yet carried the weight of it all. His story isn't just about one man's stand. It's about the power of conviction when everything else falls apart. And maybe that's why this story still matters today. Because sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone, If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more true forgotten stories of World War II soldiers, the ones who didn't just fight battles, but defined them. Because behind every order there's a human heart, and some hearts refuse to retreat.